The coffee shop on Meridian Street had the peculiar quality of making everyone who entered feel as though they'd been there before, even on their first visit. Theobald Grimsby sat in his usual corner booth, watching the steam rise from his cup in lazy spirals that seemed to dissolve into nothing before reaching the stained acoustic tiles above. He came here every Tuesday at precisely 3:17 p.m., not because he particularly enjoyed the bitter brew or the atmosphere of studied indifference that permeated the place, but because it was here that he'd first seen her. Ermintrude Ashworth had been ordering a complicated drink, something with oat milk and an extra shot and half the usual syrup, when their eyes had met across the crowded space. She'd smiled then, a genuine thing that reached her eyes and made something long dormant stir in his chest. That had been 8 months ago, and now she was late for their weekly meeting, which was unlike her. Punctuality was one of her virtues, along with her laugh and the way she unconsciously tucked her auburn hair behind her left ear when she was thinking. The bell above the door chimed, and Theobald looked up expectantly, but it was only Barnabas Worthington, the shop's owner, returning from whatever business had taken him away for the past hour. Barnabas nodded in Theobald's direction. They developed a comfortable familiarity over the months and disappeared behind the counter to resume his duties. Theobald checked his watch. 3:31 p.m. Ermintrude was 14 minutes late, which wouldn't have concerned him under normal circumstances, but today was different. Today, he carried in his jacket pocket a small velvet box that contained either the beginning of his redemption or the final confirmation of his unworthiness. The ring inside was modest by any measure, a simple band of white gold with a small diamond that had cost him 3 months' salary from his job at Pemberton and Associates, where he filed insurance claims and tried to make himself invisible. He touched the box through the fabric of his jacket and felt his pulse quicken. In another life, he could have afforded something magnificent, something worthy of the woman who had somehow seen past his carefully constructed ordinariness to find something worth loving. But that life was as dead as the newspapers that had once screamed his name in headlines he still saw in his nightmares, and he had learned to be grateful for small mercies and second chances, even when they came disguised as minimum-wage anonymity. The bell chimed again, and this time it was her. Ermintrude swept through the door with her characteristic grace, her cheeks flushed from the October wind, her green coat billowing behind her like something from a romantic film. She spotted him immediately and hurried over, shedding her coat and scarf with practiced efficiency. "I'm so sorry, Theo," she said, using the shortened version of his name that only she was permitted. "Mrs. Hepzibah kept me after class to discuss the spring curriculum, and you know how she gets when she starts talking about the importance of classical literature and modern education." Theobald smiled and stood to help her with her coat, inhaling the faint scent of her perfume, something light and floral that reminded him of gardens he'd once owned. "It's perfectly fine. I was just enjoying the ambience." She laughed at that, the sound bright and musical in the coffee shop's muted atmosphere. "Ambience? Theo, this place has all the ambience of a doctor's waiting room decorated by someone with clinical depression." "But it's our doctor's waiting room decorated by someone with clinical depression," he replied, and she laughed again, settling into the booth across from him. They fell into their usual pattern of conversation. She talked about her students at St. Agatha's Academy for Young Ladies, where she taught English literature to girls who would inherit the world but seemed determined to remain ignorant of it. And he told her carefully edited stories about his co-workers and their mundane dramas. It was comfortable, this ritual of theirs, built over months of Tuesday afternoons and weekend walks through the city's forgotten parks. She knew nothing of his past, of course. As far as Ermintrude Ashworth was concerned, Theobald Grimsby had materialized into existence on a Tuesday afternoon 8 months ago, already fully formed at 34, with no history worth discussing and no ambitions beyond their next meeting. It was better that way. Safer. But today was different. Today, he was going to risk everything he'd built in this small, careful life. Today, he was going to ask her to marry him, and in doing so, either prove that redemption was possible or confirm that some sins were too great to be forgiven, even by love. The conversation had moved to her students' latest essays on Pride and Prejudice when Theobald felt the familiar flutter of nerves in his stomach. It was now or never. He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew the small velvet box, his heart hammering against his ribs as he set it on the scarred wooden table between them. Ermintrude's eyes widened as they fixed on the box, and for a moment, the busy chatter of the coffee shop seemed to fade into a distant hum. She looked up at him, her expression unreadable. "Theo," she began, but he held up a hand to stop her. "Before you say anything," he said, his voice steadier than he felt, "I want you to know that I understand if the answer is no. I know I'm not much to look at, and I know my prospects aren't exactly impressive. But these past 8 months have been the happiest of my life, and I hoped, that maybe you felt the same way. He opened the box with trembling fingers, revealing the modest ring nestled in white satin. The diamond caught the coffee shop's fluorescent lighting and threw back tiny rainbows that danced across the table's surface. For a long moment, Ermintrude said nothing. She stared at the ring, her face cycling through expressions he couldn't quite read. Then, slowly, she began to laugh. It started as a soft chuckle, barely audible above the ambient noise of the coffee shop, but it grew steadily louder and more sustained. Other patrons began to turn in their direction, curious about the source of the increasingly inappropriate mirth. Theobald felt heat rise in his cheeks as Ermintrude's laughter took on an almost hysterical quality. "Oh, Theo," she gasped between fits of laughter, wiping tears from the corners of her eyes. "Oh, my dear, sweet, deluded Theo. You can't be serious." The words hit him like physical blows, each one driving the breath from his lungs. What? This," she said, gesturing at the ring with a dismissive wave of her hand. "This tiny little thing that probably came from a pawn shop or one of those dreadful mall jewelry stores. Did you really think I would say yes to this? Did you really think I would tie myself to someone who files insurance claims for a living and thinks this pathetic bauble is appropriate for a proposal?" The coffee shop had gone quiet around them, the other patrons no longer pretending not to listen. Theobald felt the familiar sensation of the world tilting sideways, the same feeling he'd experienced 5 years ago when everything he'd built had come crashing down around him. But this was worse, because this time he'd dared to hope. "Ermintrude, no," she said, her laughter finally subsiding into something colder and more cutting. "Just, no. I've enjoyed our little Tuesday afternoon diversions, truly I have. You're a sweet man, Theo, in your way. But marriage? To someone like you? I have standards, darling. I have expectations. And you?" She looked him up and down with an expression of barely concealed disgust. "You fall rather spectacularly short of them." She stood then, gathering her coat and scarf with swift, efficient movements. "I think it's best if we don't see each other anymore. This has become rather more complicated than I intended, and I wouldn't want to give you any more false hope." She paused at the edge of the table, looking down at him with something that might have been pity. "Find someone more suitable, Theo. Someone who would be grateful for a ring like that and a life like yours. I'm sure she's out there somewhere." And then she was gone, leaving him alone with the ring box and the stares of a dozen strangers who had witnessed his humiliation. Theobald sat there for a long time, staring at the diamond that suddenly seemed even smaller and more pathetic than before. The carefully constructed life he'd built, the identity he crafted, the hope he'd allowed himself to nurture, all of it crumbled in the space of those few terrible minutes. But as he sat there in the wreckage of his proposal, something else began to stir. Something he'd thought he'd buried forever, along with his old name and his old life. It was dark and patient and had teeth, and it whispered to him of justice and revelation and the particular satisfaction that came with watching someone realize exactly how wrong they'd been. Theobald Grimsby closed the ring box with a soft snap and slipped it back into his pocket. Then he smiled, and for just a moment, anyone watching might have glimpsed the man he used to be before he'd learned to make himself small and forgettable. Some mistakes, he reflected, deserved correction. The apartment above Cornelius Blackwood's antiquarian bookshop was exactly the sort of place where a man could disappear completely, which had made it perfect for Theobald's purposes. The walls were lined with bookshelves that held volumes he'd never read, first editions of forgotten novels, treatises on subjects that interested no one, and collections of poetry by authors whose names had long since faded from literary memory. The furniture was sparse and functional: a bed, a desk, a single armchair positioned near the window that looked out onto the narrow alley behind Meridian Street. It was here, 3 days after Ermintrude's rejection, that Theobald sat with a laptop computer and began the delicate process of resurrection. He'd spent the intervening time in a state of numbness, going through the motions of his constructed life while something deeper and more primal stirred in the depths of his psyche. He'd shown up to work at Pemberton and Associates, filed his claims, eaten his lunch at the same dreary sandwich shop he'd frequented for 2 years, and returned each evening to his monastic apartment above the bookshop. But beneath the surface, calculations were being made, possibilities weighed, and old skills dusted off like tools left too long in storage. The laptop was new, purchased with cash from 3 different electronics stores across the city. The internet connection was routed through a series of proxies and VPNs that would make tracking its origin a considerable challenge for anyone with less than federal resources. These were precautions he'd learned in his previous life, when such things had mattered for different reasons. He began with research, but the word seemed inadequate for what he was actually doing. Research implied academic curiosity, a desire to learn for learning's sake. This was reconnaissance, systematic, thorough, and conducted with the single-minded focus of a predator studying its prey. Ermintrude Ashworth, he discovered, was not as simple as she'd appeared during their Tuesday afternoon conversations. She taught at St. Agatha's Academy, yes, but she also moved in social circles that intersected with the city's elite in interesting ways. Her parents, Mortimer and Cordelia Ashworth, had been fixtures in high society until their deaths in a car accident 3 years prior, leaving their daughter with a substantial inheritance that she'd managed to keep largely hidden from casual observation. She lived alone in a converted carriage house on Pemberton Hill, the sort of neighborhood where property values were discussed in whispers and ordinary mortals feared to tread without proper documentation of their worth. Her social media presence was carefully curated but revealed glimpses of a lifestyle that suggested her teacher's salary was supplemented by other sources. There were photos from charity galas, weekend trips to Martha's Vineyard, dinner parties attended by people whose names appeared regularly in the society pages. Most interesting of all were her romantic entanglements. Theobald found traces of relationships with a series of wealthy men, each affair documented in society column mentions and photograph captions. There was Algernon Fitzwilliam, heir to a shipping fortune, who had dated her for 6 months before marrying someone more suitable to his family's expectations. Then came Bartholomew Ashford, a tech entrepreneur whose company had gone public to considerable fanfare, followed by Crispin Weatherby, whose family owned half the commercial real estate in the financial district. A pattern emerged as Theobald compiled his research. Ermintrude Ashworth was a woman who collected wealthy men like some people collected rare stamps, studying them closely before discarding them when they failed to meet her increasingly specific requirements. She was hunting, he realized, for something particular, not just wealth, but a specific combination of money, status, and malleability that would allow her to ascend to the social heights she believed she deserved. The revelation should have disgusted him, but instead it clarified something that had been bothering him since their last conversation. She hadn't rejected him because he was inadequate as a person. She'd rejected him because he didn't fit her calculations. It was, in its way, almost a relief. Almost. By the end of the first week, he had assembled a comprehensive dossier on Ermintrude Ashworth that would have impressed his former colleagues in the intelligence community. He knew her schedule, her habits, her favorite restaurants, and the names of her 3 closest friends, Millicent Carstairs, Genevieve Blackthorne, and Prudence Weatherby, Crispin's sister, which explained how that particular relationship had ended so poorly. More importantly, he knew her weaknesses. For all her social climbing and calculated romance, Ermintrude was fundamentally insecure about her position in the world. She'd grown up on the periphery of true wealth, close enough to see it but never quite able to grasp it permanently. Her parents' inheritance had given her independence, but not the kind of generational wealth that commanded automatic respect. She was always performing, always proving herself worthy of the circle she moved in. It was a vulnerability that could be exploited, given the right approach and sufficient patience. The second week was devoted to logistics. Theobald had learned, during his years in exile, that successful reinvention required attention to detail and a willingness to invest in the necessary infrastructure. He opened bank accounts under carefully constructed identities, established credit histories for personas that existed only on paper, and began the slow process of creating a legend that would withstand casual scrutiny. The man who had once been known by a different name entirely understood the importance of believable fiction. Truth was often too strange to be convincing, but a well-crafted lie could be more real than reality itself. He learned this lesson in government service, where the art of deception was practiced at the highest levels, and the most successful operations were those that seemed almost mundane in their execution. By the third week, he was ready to begin phase 2 of his plan. The key, he'd realized, was not to approach Ermintrude directly. She'd made her feelings about Theobald Grimsby abundantly clear, and any attempt to win her back would be both futile and beneath the dignity of what he was planning. Instead, he would become someone else entirely, someone who possessed everything she thought she wanted and could give her access to the world she'd been trying to enter her entire adult life. The transformation began with the physical. Theobald had always been unremarkable in appearance, average height, brown hair that he kept conservatively cut, features that blended into crowds and were quickly forgotten. But unremarkable was a choice, he learned, as much as distinctive was. A different haircut, contact lenses instead of glasses, a wardrobe upgrade funded by careful liquidation of assets he'd hidden years ago. These small changes could alter not just how others saw him, but how he saw himself. He engaged the services of Lysander Cromwell, a personal stylist whose client list included several members of the city's cultural elite. Lysander was expensive, discreet, and possessed of the particular talent that allowed him to see not just what his clients were, but what they could become. "You have good bones," Lysander observed during their first consultation, circling Theobald like a sculptor examining raw marble. "Strong jaw, good shoulders. You've been hiding your light under a bushel, haven't you? All those dreary clothes and that tragic haircut. We can work with this." The process took weeks. Theobald's wardrobe was rebuilt from the ground up with suits from Savile Row, shoes from Italian craftsmen, and accessories that cost more than most people earned in a month. His hair was restyled by a master barber who treated each cut like a work of art. A personal trainer helped him refine his posture and carriage, teaching him to move with the unconscious confidence that came with generational wealth. But the physical transformation was only the beginning. More challenging was the creation of a new identity that would not only fool casual observation but withstand the scrutiny of people who made their living by distinguishing the authentic from the counterfeit. He chose the name Maximilian Ashford Blackwood, a combination that suggested old money and multiple family lines without being so specific as to invite detailed genealogical research. The fictional biography he constructed was a masterpiece of careful ambiguity. Educated at exclusive schools whose records were conveniently difficult to access. Early career in European finance during a period when such things were less meticulously documented. Recent return to America following the settlement of a complex family estate. The beauty of the identity lay in its very vagueness. People who moved in elite circles were accustomed to encountering others whose backgrounds were intentionally obscure. Witness protection alumni, recovering addicts from prominent families, black sheep returning to the fold after decades of wandering. As long as one had money and knew the right social codes, questions about origins were considered impolite. And Maximilian Ashford Blackwood had money. Theobald had spent years carefully moving and investing the assets he'd accumulated in his previous life, creating a network of accounts and holdings that could support whatever identity he chose to assume. The funds weren't unlimited. He wasn't actually wealthy enough to sustain the illusion indefinitely, but they were sufficient for his purposes, provided he was strategic about their deployment. The final piece of the puzzle was establishing Maximilian's presence in the social ecosystem that Ermintrude inhabited. This required careful timing and considerable patience. Theobald began attending charity events, gallery openings, and dinner parties where he could be seen but not scrutinized too closely. He donated generously to causes favored by the city's elite, ensuring his name appeared on the right donor lists and program acknowledgments. He was building a reputation, creating the paper trail and social connections that would make Maximilian Ashford Blackwood seem like a natural part of the world Ermintrude desperately wanted to join. It was slow work, requiring months of careful cultivation, but Theobald had learned patience during his years of exile. Good revenge, like good wine, improved with age and proper attention. By December, Maximilian Ashford Blackwood was beginning to be noticed by the right people. His name appeared in society column mentions, always in connection with worthy causes or cultural events. He was photographed at gallery openings, looking distinguished in his bespoke suits, always with an attractive but unnamed companion who was actually Cordelia Ashworth, not Ermintrude's mother, who was dead, but a professional escort who specialized in providing companionship for social events and had been thoroughly briefed on her role. The escorts were expensive but necessary. A wealthy, eligible bachelor who appeared at social events alone was an object of curiosity and speculation. One who appeared with a series of elegant, intelligent women suggested a man of discernment who was simply waiting for the right person to settle down with. It also served to make him seem more desirable. Nothing attracted interest like the appearance of being in demand. Theobald was careful never to appear at events where Ermintrude might be present. He wanted her to hear about him before she saw him, to build curiosity and anticipation. He wanted his reputation to precede him, to create an aura of mystery and desirability that would make their eventual meeting seem like destiny rather than calculation. The first mention came in late December, during a conversation he had arranged to overhear. Millicent Carstairs was telling Genevieve Blackthorne about the new patron who had endowed a reading room at the city's main library, a mysterious figure named Maximilian Ashford Blackwood, who had appeared seemingly from nowhere with impeccable credentials and a seven-figure donation. Nobody knows quite where he came from, Millicent was saying as Theobald pretended to examine a painting at the Metropolitan Museum's winter exhibition. European money, apparently. Very old family, very discreet. Cynthia Weatherby says he's absolutely charming, and you know how particular she is. Single? Genevieve asked with the directness that characterized her approach to most subjects. Evidently, though he's been seen with some lovely women. Nothing serious, from what I hear. I think he's just getting his bearings. You know how it is when someone moves to a new city. Someone should introduce him around properly. A man like that shouldn't be left to navigate our little social labyrinth alone. I was thinking the same thing. Perhaps at the New Year's Eve gala at the Pemberton Club? If he's going to be one of us, he should meet the right people. Theobald smiled to himself as he moved on to the next painting. Phase 3 of his plan was about to begin. The Pemberton Club's New Year's Eve Gala was the sort of event that existed primarily to remind people of their place in the social hierarchy. Held in the club's grand ballroom, with its crystal chandeliers and oil portraits of long-dead financiers, it drew the city's elite like moths to an exceptionally expensive flame. The guest list was carefully curated, the champagne was imported from specific French villages, and the small talk was conducted with the precision of diplomatic negotiations. Theobald arrived as Maximilian Ashford Blackwood precisely 15 minutes after the event's official start time. Fashionably late, without being disrespectfully so. He wore a midnight blue dinner jacket that had been tailored to showcase his newly refined physique, and moved through the crowd with the easy confidence of a man who belonged in such surroundings. Several people nodded in recognition, their acknowledgments carrying the weight of tentative social acceptance. He had not seen Ermintrude yet, but he knew she was here. His reconnaissance had confirmed her attendance weeks in advance, along with the details of her dress, midnight green silk, purchased from a boutique she couldn't quite afford. Her escort for the evening, Nigel Pemberton, a banking heir whose intelligence was inversely proportional to his trust fund, and her likely location within the ballroom, near the windows overlooking the garden, where the lighting was most flattering. Instead of seeking her out immediately, Maximilian began working the room with practiced efficiency. He spoke with Cornelius Blackwood about rare book acquisitions, discussed market trends with Algernon Fitzwilliam, and charmed Cynthia Weatherby with subtle compliments about her latest philanthropic endeavor. Each conversation was brief but memorable, designed to reinforce his growing reputation as a man of substance and discretion. It was nearly 10 o'clock when he finally caught sight of her. Ermintrude stood near the tall windows, exactly where his intelligence had suggested she would be, looking radiant in her green silk gown. Her auburn hair was arranged in an elegant updo that exposed the graceful line of her neck, and she wore jewelry that suggested prosperity without quite achieving genuine wealth. She was listening to something Nigel Pemberton was saying with the practiced attention of someone skilled in making boring men feel interesting. For a moment, seeing her again, Theobald felt an echo of the emotion that had driven him to purchase that modest engagement ring months earlier. She was genuinely beautiful, and during their Tuesday afternoon conversations, he had glimpsed moments of intelligence and humor that had seemed authentic. But then he remembered her laughter, the casual cruelty of her rejection, and the warm feeling hardened into something sharper and more purposeful. He waited until she was momentarily alone. Nigel had wandered off to refresh their drinks before making his approach. He timed it perfectly, arriving at her location just as Millicent Carstairs approached from the opposite direction. "Ermintrude, darling," Millicent called out, "there's someone I simply must introduce you to. This is Maximilian Ashford Blackwood, the gentleman I was telling you about. Maximilian, this is Ermintrude Ashworth, one of our most treasured educators and a dear friend." Maximilian turned toward Ermintrude with an expression of polite interest, as though seeing her for the first time. "Miss Ashworth," he said, extending his hand with old-world courtesy. "A pleasure to make your acquaintance." The transformation in Ermintrude's demeanor was immediate and complete. The slightly bored expression she'd worn while listening to Nigel vanished, replaced by the bright, engaged smile she reserved for potentially important encounters. She took his offered hand with graceful fingers, her touch lingering just a moment longer than propriety strictly required. "Mr. Ashford Blackwood," she replied, her voice carrying a warmth that Theobald recognized from their early Tuesday conversations. "I've heard such wonderful things about you. Your support of the arts has been quite remarkable. Please, call me Maximilian," he said, his own voice carrying the slight hint of an accent that suggested European education without being specific enough to identify. "And I hope I haven't been the subject of too much gossip. You know how people talk." Ermintrude laughed, the sound bright and musical. "Only the very best gossip, I assure you. Though I must say, there's been quite a bit of speculation about your background. You've managed to become one of our most fascinating mysteries." "Mystery is often more interesting than reality," Maximilian replied, releasing her hand with apparent reluctance. "Though I find that the most fascinating people are usually those who reveal themselves slowly, like particularly good novels." "You read novels?" Ermintrude asked, her interest sharpening. "How refreshing. So many people in business seem to think literature is frivolous." "Business is merely a means to an end," Maximilian said dismissively. "The real purpose of wealth is to provide the freedom to pursue more elevated interests. Art, literature, music. These are what make life worth living, don't you think?" It was exactly the right thing to say, Theobald knew. Ermintrude had always felt slightly defensive about her career as a teacher, as though she needed to justify her intellectual pursuits to the wealthy men she courted. To have someone of apparent means validate her interests was intoxicating. Their conversation was interrupted by Nigel's return with their drinks, but Maximilian handled the introduction smoothly, engaging the younger man in conversation about his work at the family bank while somehow managing to make Ermintrude feel like the most important person in the group. It was a delicate social ballet, one that required considerable skill to execute properly. As the evening progressed, Maximilian found himself naturally drawn back to Ermintrude's orbit. Not obviously, he was careful to circulate, to speak with other guests, to avoid appearing too focused on any one person. But somehow their paths kept crossing, their conversations resumed with the ease of old familiarity, and by the time midnight approached, they had established a rapport that felt both effortless and inevitable. When the clock struck 12 and champagne flutes were raised in celebration of the new year, Maximilian found himself standing beside Ermintrude as confetti fell like snow around them. The moment called for some acknowledgement, some gesture to mark the transition from one year to the next, and he turned to her with a smile that managed to be both intimate and respectful. "To new beginnings," he said, raising his glass. "To new beginnings," she echoed, her eyes meeting as over the rim of her champagne flute. The kiss that followed was brief, appropriate to the setting, but it carried an undercurrent of possibility that left them both slightly breathless. Around them, other couples were embracing, friends were laughing, and the orchestra was playing Auld Lang Syne, with the sort of grandeur that only a live string section could provide. "I feel like I've been waiting all evening to have a proper conversation with you," Ermintrude said when they separated, her cheeks flushed with champagne and something else. "Then we should remedy that situation," Maximilian replied. "Perhaps we could continue this conversation over dinner sometime? I know a small place that serves the most remarkable cuisine, very intimate, very private." The invitation hung in the air between them, weighted with possibility. Theobald could see the calculations taking place behind Ermintrude's eyes, the assessment of his apparent wealth, his social connections, his potential value as a romantic partner. It was fascinating to watch, like observing a master craftsman at work. "I would like that very much," she said finally, and he could hear the careful control in her voice that kept her from seeming too eager. They exchanged contact information. Maximilian's cards were printed on heavy stock and featured only his name and a discreet phone number, and made tentative plans to meet the following week. As the evening wound down and guests began to make their departures, Theobald felt a satisfaction that had nothing to do with the champagne he'd consumed. Phase 3 had been a complete success. The trap was set, the bait was taken, and the prey was beginning to move exactly as he had anticipated. Soon, very soon, Ermintrude Ashworth would discover what it felt like to be on the receiving end of casual cruelty and calculated dismissal. But first, he had to make her fall in love with him. The restaurant Maximilian chose for their first dinner was everything Ermintrude could have wanted and nothing she expected. Le Bernardin Noir occupied the top floor of a converted warehouse in what had once been the city's industrial district, its entrance so discreet that finding it required either advanced knowledge or considerable determination. The interior was all exposed brick and candlelight, with tables spaced far enough apart to guarantee privacy and service so attentive it bordered on telepathic. Ermintrude arrived wearing a black cocktail dress that she'd purchased specifically for the occasion, charging it to a credit card that was already uncomfortably close to its limit. She'd spent the better part of 2 hours on her appearance, understanding instinctively that this dinner represented more than a simple social engagement. This was an audition, a test, a chance to prove herself worthy of whatever Maximilian Ashford Blackwood might have to offer. He was already seated when she arrived, having claimed a corner table that offered views of the city's glittering skyline. He rose to greet her with the sort of old-world courtesy that seemed to be rapidly disappearing from modern society, helping her with her coat and ensuring she was comfortably seated before resuming his own place. "You look absolutely radiant," he said, and the compliment felt genuine rather than obligatory. "That dress is particularly becoming on you." "Thank you," Ermintrude replied, pleased that her investment had been noticed. "This place is incredible. I had no idea it existed." "It's one of the city's best-kept secrets," Maximilian said, signaling discreetly for the sommelier. The chef trained in France but refuses to advertise or court publicity. He prefers to let the quality of his work speak for itself. The sommelier approached with deferential efficiency, and Maximilian engaged in a brief, knowledgeable conversation about wine pairings that demonstrated both sophistication and restraint. He was clearly familiar with the establishment, Ermintrude noted, but not in the ostentatious way of someone trying to impress. Everything about his behavior suggested that this level of luxury was simply normal for him. As they settled into conversation over the first course, something involving truffles and ingredients Ermintrude couldn't pronounce, she found herself genuinely charmed by his company. Maximilian possessed the rare gift of being able to discuss serious subjects without seeming pedantic, to display his knowledge without making others feel ignorant, and to ask questions that suggested genuine interest in her responses. "Tell me about your students," he said as they shared a perfectly prepared fish course. "What do you think of the current generation? Are they as hopeless as everyone claims, or is there reason for optimism?" It was exactly the sort of question that allowed Ermintrude to showcase her intelligence and passion for her work. She found herself speaking more freely than she had in months, sharing anecdotes about her students' insights and frustrations, discussing the challenges of teaching classical literature to minds shaped by social media and instant gratification. Maximilian listened with the focused attention of someone genuinely interested in what she had to say. He asked follow-up questions that demonstrated he was actually processing her words, offered observations that showed he understood the complexities of modern education, and somehow managed to make her feel like the most fascinating person he'd ever encountered. "You have a gift," he said as their main courses arrived. "The ability to make others care about things they never knew they wanted to understand. It's quite rare, and more valuable than most people realize." "You're very kind," Ermintrude replied, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the wine. "Though I sometimes wonder if I'm making any real difference. The girls I teach will inherit positions of influence, but so many of them seem determined to waste their advantages." "Perhaps the difference you make won't be apparent for years," Maximilian suggested. "The best teachers often plant seeds that don't bloom until their students are much older. You may be shaping minds in ways you'll never know about." It was a generous perspective, one that reframed her daily frustrations in a more hopeful light. Ermintrude found herself looking at this man across the table with growing appreciation. He was not only wealthy and cultured, but genuinely thoughtful, a combination that was rarer than diamonds in her experience. As the evening progressed, she began to learn more about him, though he revealed details about himself with the careful pacing of someone skilled in the art of conversation. He spoke of his education in Switzerland and England, his early career in international finance, and his recent decision to settle in America and focus on philanthropic endeavors. "I spent too many years focused on acquisition," he said over dessert, a creation that involved chocolate and fruit in proportions that seemed almost mathematical in their precision. "Making money, building portfolios, expanding influence. It took me longer than it should have to realize that wealth without purpose is just elaborate bookkeeping." "What changed your mind?" Ermintrude asked, genuinely curious. Maximilian paused, seeming to consider his words carefully. "A personal loss," he said finally. "Someone very important to me died unexpectedly, and I realized I'd been so busy accumulating resources that I'd forgotten why I wanted them in the first place. It made me reassess everything." There was a moment of comfortable silence as they both contemplated the weight of such revelations. Ermintrude felt herself drawn to this hint of vulnerability, this suggestion that beneath his polished exterior lay someone who had experienced genuine pain and emerged with hard-won wisdom. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said softly. "Thank you. It was difficult." But it taught me that the only wealth that matters is the kind that allows you to create meaning, to support things that outlast your own existence. Art, education, human connection, these are the investments that pay dividends beyond the grave. It was exactly what she wanted to hear from a man of his apparent means, and yet it felt authentic rather than calculated. Throughout the evening, Maximilian had demonstrated a depth of character that set him apart from the other wealthy men she'd known. Where Algernon had been shallow, Bartholomew crude, and Crispin simply boring, Maximilian possessed a combination of intelligence, culture, and emotional sophistication that was genuinely attractive. As they lingered over coffee, their conversation drifted to more personal topics. He asked about her family, her childhood, her dreams and disappointments, and somehow made sharing such details feel natural rather than invasive. She found herself telling him things she rarely discussed with anyone: her complicated relationship with her parents' legacy, her struggles to find her place in a world that seemed to value breeding over achievement, her desire to make a meaningful contribution to something larger than herself. "You're quite remarkable, you know," he said as the evening drew to a close. "Intelligent, passionate, beautiful, and completely unaware of your own worth. It's a potent combination." The compliment made her flush with pleasure, particularly because it seemed to come from genuine observation rather than practiced charm. When he walked her to her car, their parting was marked by another kiss, this one longer and more significant than their New Year's Eve encounter. "I'd very much like to see you again," he said, his hand still resting gently on her waist. "I'd like that too," she replied, surprised by how much she meant it. They began seeing each other regularly after that, their courtship unfolding with the sort of elegant progression that belonged in classic romantic literature. Maximilian was everything Ermintrude had been searching for without quite knowing it: wealthy enough to provide security and access, cultured enough to stimulate her intellectually, and attentive enough to make her feel genuinely valued. He took her to art gallery openings where his knowledge of the pieces and their creators made her feel like she was receiving a private education. He brought her to dinner parties hosted by people whose names appeared regularly in society columns, always ensuring she was properly introduced and included in conversations. He sent her books he thought she'd enjoy, with handwritten notes that demonstrated he'd actually read them himself. Most importantly, he made her feel like she was rising in the world rather than constantly fighting to maintain her position. With Maximilian, she didn't have to perform or prove herself worthy of attention. He seemed to assume her intelligence and value, treating her as an equal rather than a supplicant. The physical aspect of their relationship developed with similar thoughtfulness. He was patient but not passive, attentive to her responses without being demanding about his own needs. When they finally became intimate, 3 weeks after their first dinner, it was in his penthouse apartment overlooking the harbor, a space that managed to be both luxurious and comfortable, filled with art and books that suggested a life lived with intention and taste. Lying in his arms afterward, looking out at the city lights reflected in the water below, Ermintrude felt a contentment she hadn't experienced in years. This was what she'd been working toward all along, she realized. Not just wealth or status, but partnership with someone who could match her intellectually while providing the security and lifestyle she craved. "What are you thinking about?" Maximilian asked, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "How lucky I am," she said, and meant it completely. What she didn't know was that in another room of the same apartment, carefully hidden cameras had recorded their entire encounter. What she couldn't see was the expression on Maximilian's face as she spoke, a mixture of satisfaction and something much colder. And what she couldn't possibly suspect was that the man whose arms held her so tenderly was already planning the precise moment when he would destroy everything she thought they'd built together. The revenge was proceeding exactly as Theobald had envisioned, but he was discovering something unexpected in the process. Playing the role of someone worthy of love was awakening feelings he'd thought were dead. Each evening spent with Ermintrude, each conversation that revealed her intelligence and vulnerability, each moment of genuine connection between them was complicating his originally simple plan. He told himself it didn't matter. She had rejected Theobald Grimsby with casual cruelty, had laughed at his modest offering, and dismissed him as beneath her consideration. The fact that she was now falling in love with Maximilian Ashford Blackwood only proved the shallowness of her character and the justice of what he intended to do to her. But late at night, alone in his apartment above the bookshop where he still sometimes retreated to maintain his original identity, Theobald found himself questioning whether revenge was worth the cost he was beginning to pay for it. Because the uncomfortable truth was that Maximilian Ashford Blackwood was falling in love with Ermintrude Ashworth, and that was never supposed to be part of the plan. Spring arrived early that year, transforming the city's parks into exhibitions of calculated beauty that reminded Theobald of the careful artifice of his own situation. He had been Maximilian Ashford Blackwood for 4 months now, and the identity fit him like a bespoke suit, perfectly tailored to his purposes but somehow constraining in ways he hadn't anticipated. His relationship with Ermintrude had deepened beyond his initial calculations. What had begun as an elaborate performance designed to facilitate revenge had evolved into something more complex and troubling. She had moved into his penthouse apartment 3 weeks earlier, bringing with her a collection of first-edition novels and a presence that somehow made the space feel more like a home than the showcase it had been designed to be. They had established routines together, morning coffee while reading different sections of the newspaper, evening walks along the harbor when the weather permitted, lazy Sunday afternoon spent in the reading room he had constructed for her, complete with her favorite chair position to catch the best natural light. She had begun leaving small traces of herself throughout the apartment, books with marked passages, coffee cups forgotten on side tables, the faint scent of her perfume lingering in rooms she had recently occupied. It should have felt like victory, this evidence of her growing attachment and dependence. Instead, it felt like an increasingly complex form of imprisonment, one that confined them both within the boundaries of his elaborate deception. The morning everything began to unravel started unremarkably. Ermintrude was preparing for school, moving through her routine with the efficient grace he had learned to appreciate. She wore a blue dress that brought out the color of her eyes, her auburn hair swept back in a style that was both professional and elegant. Watching her apply lipstick in the bathroom mirror, Theobald felt the familiar pang of something that might have been genuine affection if the circumstances had been different. "I'll be late tonight," she said, gathering her materials for the day. "Faculty meeting about the spring curriculum. Probably won't be home until 8 or 9. "I'll have dinner waiting," Maximilian replied, the domesticity of the exchange both comfortable and disturbing. "That salmon you like from the place on 5th Street. She kissed him goodbye with the casual intimacy of established couples, and he watched from the window as she walked to her car, her movements confident in a way they hadn't been when he'd first approached her as Maximilian. Living with him had given her a security and poise that transformed her from someone constantly performing her worth into someone who simply assumed it. It was after she left that the first crack appeared in his carefully constructed facade. The call came on a secure line, the number known only to a handful of people from his previous life. Theobald had maintained these connections as insurance, understanding that complete isolation was more dangerous than selective engagement with his former world. The voice on the other end belonged to Cordelia Ashworth, not the escort who sometimes accompanied him to social events, but Cordelia Ashworth née Blackwood, a former colleague whose intelligence work had occasionally intersected with his own. "Theodore," she said, using the name he hadn't heard spoken aloud in over 2 years. The sound of it sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the apartment's temperature. "We need to talk." "I think you have the wrong number," he replied carefully. Theodore Ashworth Blackwood, formerly of the Central Intelligence Agency's European Division, currently masquerading as a philanthropist and conducting what appears to be an elaborate confidence scheme involving one Ermintrude Ashworth. Did I miss anything important? The thoroughness of her knowledge was both impressive and terrifying. Theobald felt the familiar sensation of walls closing in, the same feeling he'd experienced when his original identity had been compromised and he'd been forced into exile. "What do you want?" he asked. "A conversation. In person. Today." The usual place. The line went dead, leaving Theobald staring at the phone and contemplating the rapid disintegration of everything he'd built over the past months. Cordelia Ashworth had been one of the agency's most effective operatives, specializing in long-term infiltration and psychological manipulation. If she had discovered his current identity and activities, it meant his operational security had been compromised in ways he hadn't anticipated. The usual place was a coffee shop in Georgetown that had served as a meeting point for intelligence operatives who needed to conduct business away from official oversight. Theobald hadn't been there in 3 years, but he remembered the layout perfectly. Small tables positioned to facilitate private conversation, multiple exits for rapid departure if necessary, and a clientele that minded their own business as a matter of survival. He arrived early and selected a corner table that offered clear sightlines to all entrances. Cordelia appeared precisely on time, looking exactly as he remembered, tall, elegant, with silver-streaked blonde hair and the sort of classic features that made her equally comfortable at embassy receptions and back-alley exchanges. She moved with the controlled grace of someone who had spent decades being observed and had learned to reveal nothing through body language alone. "Theodore," she said, settling into the chair across from him with familiar efficiency. "You're looking well. Civilian life seems to agree with you. What do you want, Cordelia?" "Straight to business." "I appreciate that." She signaled for coffee with a gesture so subtle it was barely perceptible. "I want to discuss your current project? This elaborate seduction of Miss Ashworth. It's quite impressive, really. The attention to detail, the psychological sophistication, the sheer audacity of it all. Very much in keeping with your reputation." "I don't know what you're talking about." "Of course you don't. Just like you don't know that Ermintrude Ashworth rejected a marriage proposal from one Theobald Grimsby approximately 6 months ago, laughing at his modest engagement ring and dismissing him as socially and financially inadequate. Just like you don't know that Theobald Grimsby bears a remarkable physical resemblance to you, despite having different colored eyes and hair. Remarkable coincidence, really." Theobald said nothing, but his silence was answer enough. "The question," Cordelia continued, "is what you plan to do with her once you've finished playing house. Because make no mistake, Theodore, this can't continue indefinitely. The financial resources required to maintain the Maximilian identity are substantial, and even your considerable hidden assets aren't infinite. Eventually, you'll have to choose between maintaining the facade and preserving your security. Again, what do you want?" "I want to make you an offer. A way out of this situation that serves both of our interests." She reached into her purse and withdrew a manila envelope, placing it on the table between them. "There's a situation developing in Prague that requires someone with your particular skills. Long-term assignment, excellent compensation, and most importantly, complete identity protection. You could disappear entirely, become someone new, and never worry about your past catching up with you." "And Ermintrude? What about her?" "She's a civilian who got caught up in something she doesn't understand. Once you disappear, she'll mourn the loss of Maximilian Ashford Blackwood for an appropriate period, then move on to the next wealthy man who meets her criteria. Everyone wins." Theobald stared at the envelope, understanding that it represented both salvation and damnation. Taking the assignment would solve his immediate problems but would also mean abandoning everything he'd built with Ermintrude, leaving her to discover that the man she'd fallen in love with had never really existed. "Why?" he asked. "Why offer me this?" "Because you're good at what you do, and the agency occasionally has need of people who are officially dead. Because I knew you in the old days and remember what you were capable of when properly motivated. And because—" She paused, seeming to consider her words. "Because I think you're in deeper than you intended to be, and continuing down this path will destroy you both." "You think I care about her?" "I think you've been playing the role of someone capable of love for so long that you've forgotten it was supposed to be an act. I think you've created a version of yourself that she could genuinely care for, and now you're trapped by your own success. I think you're discovering that revenge is considerably more complicated when you have to live with its consequences every day." She wasn't wrong, and they both knew it. What had begun as calculated psychological warfare had evolved into something that felt dangerously close to the real thing. Living with Ermintrude, sharing intimate moments with her, watching her face light up when she saw him, it had all become confusingly genuine, as though the performance had somehow transformed into reality. "I need time to think," Theobald said finally. "You have 48 hours. After that, the offer expires, and you'll be on your own with whatever consequences follow." Cordelia stood, leaving the envelope on the table. "For what it's worth, Theodore, I hope you make the right choice. You were too good an operative to waste on a civilian revenge fantasy." She left without another word, moving through the coffee shop with the same controlled grace she'd displayed upon arrival. Theobald sat alone at the table, staring at the envelope and trying to calculate the true cost of every decision available to him. That evening, he returned to the penthouse to find Ermintrude waiting for him with dinner prepared and candles lit. She had changed from her teaching clothes into a silk dress he'd bought for her, and her hair fell in soft waves around her shoulders. The domestic scene was picture-perfect, exactly what he'd been working toward when he'd first conceived his plan for revenge. "How was your day?" she asked, rising to greet him with a kiss that tasted like wine and possibility. "Complicated," he replied, holding her perhaps a moment longer than usual. Over dinner, she talked about her students and their latest insights into the literature she was teaching them. She mentioned a particularly gifted girl who had written an essay about redemption and great expectations that had moved her to tears. She spoke about her plans for the summer, tentatively including him in activities that extended months into the future. "Millicent mentioned that her family has a house in the Hamptons," she said over dessert. She thought we might like to join them for a weekend in July. Would that interest you? The question hung in the air between them, weighted with assumptions about their future together. Theobald looked across the table at this woman who had fallen in love with a man who didn't exist, who was making plans that included someone who might disappear at any moment, and felt something twist in his chest that might have been guilt or grief or both. That sounds lovely, he heard himself say, and hated how much he meant it. Later, as they lay in bed together, Ermintrude traced patterns on his chest with her fingertips, her touch gentle and possessive in the way of someone who felt secure in her affections. "Max," she said softly. "Yes, I know we haven't talked about the future much, but I want you to know that I'm happy. Happier than I've been in years. Whatever happens, I want you to know that." He turned to look at her in the dim light filtering through the bedroom windows, seeing in her face an openness and vulnerability that made his chest ache. This was the woman who had laughed at Theobald Grimsby's proposal, who had dismissed him as unworthy of consideration. But it was also the woman who read poetry to him on Sunday mornings, who brought him coffee in bed when he was sick, who had somehow made him remember what it felt like to be genuinely cared for. "I'm happy too," he said, and realized it was true in ways that complicated everything he thought he knew about himself and his motivations. She smiled and settled against him, her breathing gradually evening out as she drifted towards sleep. Theobald lay awake long into the night, staring at the ceiling and trying to reconcile the man he had been with the man he was becoming, the revenge he had planned with the love he had accidentally discovered. The envelope from Cordelia sat on his desk in another room, offering escape from a situation that was becoming more impossible with each passing day. But escape would mean destroying Ermintrude in the process, leaving her to pick up the pieces of a relationship that had been built on lies from its very foundation. As dawn began to creep through the windows, Theobald realized that his elaborate plan for revenge had succeeded beyond his wildest expectations. He had made Ermintrude Ashworth fall in love with him, had given her everything she thought she wanted, had positioned himself to hurt her more deeply than she had ever hurt him. The only problem was that somewhere in the process, he had fallen in love with her too. The revelation came to Theobald on a Tuesday morning, exactly 8 months after his first encounter with Ermintrude at the coffee shop on Meridian Street. The irony of the timing wasn't lost on him. Tuesday had been their day, the weekly rhythm around which he'd built his identity as the forgettable insurance claims processor who had dared to dream above his station. He was alone in the penthouse, Ermintrude having left early for a faculty retreat that would keep her away until evening. The manila envelope from Cordelia sat unopened on his desk. Its 48-hour deadline expired 3 days ago. He hadn't called her back, hadn't made any decision about the Prague assignment, had simply let the opportunity dissolve into the realm of missed chances and abandoned possibilities. Instead, he had spent those 3 days observing Ermintrude with the clinical attention of a scientist studying a specimen, trying to separate his genuine feelings from the Stockholm Syndrome-like attachment that could develop during extended undercover operations. He had watched her grade papers while humming unconsciously to herself, had noted the way she organized her books according to some system that made sense only to her, had cataloged the small rituals and habits that comprised her daily existence. What he discovered was that his feelings for her were real in ways that had nothing to do with his original motivation or the manufactured circumstances of their relationship. Maximilian Ashford Blackwood might have been a fiction, but the emotions he experienced while inhabiting that identity were authentic. The man who brought her coffee in the morning, who listened to her discuss her students' progress, who held her while she slept, that man loved her completely, even if he existed only as a carefully constructed lie. The problem was that Theobald Grimsby also loved her, and Theobald Grimsby was the man she had rejected with casual cruelty 8 months earlier. This was the contradiction that had kept him awake for 3 consecutive nights, pacing the apartment like a caged animal while she slept peacefully in their shared bed. How could the same woman who had laughed at his modest proposal now share intimate moments with him that felt more real than anything he'd experienced in years? How could she claim to love him while remaining completely ignorant of who he actually was? The answer, he was beginning to understand, was that Ermintrude Ashworth was capable of loving someone, but only if that someone met her very specific criteria for worthiness. She had fallen in love with Maximilian's wealth, his culture, his social connections, and his ability to provide her with the lifestyle she craved. The man beneath those attributes remained largely invisible to her, which meant that her love was both genuine and fundamentally conditional. It was this realization that finally drove him to make the phone call he'd been avoiding. "Cornelius," he said when the antiquarian bookseller answered. "It's Theobald. I need a favor." Cornelius Blackwood had been his landlord for over 2 years, But more than that, he had been the closest thing to a friend that Theobald had allowed himself during his exile. Their relationship was built on mutual respect for privacy and a shared love of literature, conducted through conversations that never strayed into personal territory but somehow managed to be genuinely meaningful. "What sort of favor?" Cornelius asked, his voice carrying the slight wariness of someone who understood that favors in their world often came with complications. "I need you to deliver a message. To someone who thinks I'm dead." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Theobald, I've made it a point never to ask about your circumstances, but if you're planning something that might bring danger to my establishment." "Nothing like that," Theobald assured him. "Just a message. To a woman named Ermintrude Ashworth. She teaches at St. Agatha's Academy. The woman who broke your heart." Theobald was surprised by the bluntness of the observation. "You knew about that? I know that 8 months ago you were a man planning to propose marriage, and then suddenly you weren't. I know that you started spending money you claimed not to have and disappeared for long periods without explanation. I know that you've been living a double life, though I've respected your privacy enough not to inquire about the details. And I know that something is about to come to an end, or you wouldn't be calling me." It was more insight than Theobald had expected from someone he'd thought was simply his bookish, reclusive landlord. But then, Cornelius Blackwood had survived decades in the antiquarian book trade, which required its own forms of discretion and observation. Perhaps he'd seen more than he'd let on. "What message?" Cornelius asked. "Tell her that Theobald Grimsby is alive and would like to see her. Tell her to meet him at the coffee shop on Meridian Street tomorrow at 3:17 p.m. Tell her he has something important to discuss with her. And if she refuses, then she refuses. But I think she'll come. Curiosity, if nothing else." After ending the call, Theobald sat in the silence of the penthouse and tried to imagine how the conversation would unfold. He had spent months planning his revenge, had executed it with precision and patience, had achieved everything he'd set out to accomplish. Ermintrude Ashworth was in love with him, dependent on him, vulnerable to whatever cruelty he chose to inflict. But somewhere in the process of becoming someone worthy of her love, he had lost his appetite for revenge. The man who had sat in that coffee shop 8 months ago, nursing his wounded pride and planning elaborate retribution, felt like a stranger to him now. The pain of her rejection hadn't disappeared, but it had been transformed by months of genuine intimacy into something more complex and harder to categorize. He spent the rest of the day preparing for what might be his final performance as Maximilian Ashford Blackwood. He arranged for flowers to be delivered to the penthouse with a note explaining that business had called him away unexpectedly but that he would return soon. He transferred a substantial sum to an account in Ermintrude's name, enough to support her comfortably for several years while she decided what to do with the rest of her life. He wrote a letter explaining as much of the truth as he dared, though he doubted she would believe it even if she bothered to read it. The hardest part was deciding what to do with the engagement ring that had started everything. The modest diamond that Ermintrude had found so laughable sat in its velvet box in his safe, a symbol of simpler times when he believed that love might be enough to bridge the gap between who he was and who he wanted to be. He considered throwing it away, burying it, or selling it back to the jeweler who had seemed so hopeful when Theobald had first made the purchase. Instead, he slipped it into his pocket. Tomorrow, he would give Ermintrude Ashworth one last chance to prove that her capacity for love extended beyond the boundaries of wealth and social status. If she could accept Theobald Grimsby's proposal now, knowing what she knew about the power of genuine affection, then perhaps there was hope for both of them. If not, then at least he would know that his revenge had been complete, even if he no longer wanted it. That evening, when Ermintrude returned from her faculty retreat, she found the flowers and the note but no sign of Maximilian. She called his phone several times, leaving increasingly worried messages, but received no response. By midnight, she was pacing the apartment in a silk nightgown, alternating between concern for his safety and fear that he had abandoned her without explanation. She never suspected that he was watching her from the building across the street, using surveillance equipment he'd acquired during his years in intelligence work. She couldn't know that every moment of her distress was being cataloged by someone who loved her enough to destroy himself for her happiness, or who hated her enough to derive satisfaction from her suffering. The truth was that Theobald was no longer certain which emotion was stronger or whether there was actually any difference between them. Love and hate, he was discovering, were often separated by nothing more than perspective and circumstance. Tomorrow, in a coffee shop that had witnessed both the beginning and the potential end of their story, he would find out which emotion would ultimately define them both. The anticipation was almost unbearable, but it was also strangely liberating. After months of living as someone else, of maintaining careful lies and navigating complex deceptions, he was finally going to tell the truth. Whatever happened next would at least have the virtue of being honest, which was more than he could say for anything that had passed between them since New Year's Eve. As he watched Ermintrude finally collapse into bed, exhausted by worry and confusion, Theobald allowed himself one last moment of tenderness for the woman who had unknowingly shaped the last year of his life. Tomorrow, she would either prove herself capable of the kind of love that transcended social conventions and material considerations, or she would confirm that her affections were as conditional and calculated as he'd originally believed. Either way, the performance would finally be over. The coffee shop on Meridian Street looked exactly as it had 8 months earlier, as though it existed in a bubble of deliberate stagnation while the world changed around it. The same stained acoustic tiles, the same mismatched furniture, the same atmosphere of studied indifference that had made it the perfect setting for anonymous meetings and forgotten conversations. Theobald arrived at precisely 3 p.m., 17 minutes before their scheduled meeting time, and selected the same corner booth where he'd sat as an insurance claims processor with romantic delusions and a modest engagement ring. He wore the clothes of his original identity, a simple gray suit from a department store, unremarkable glasses instead of contact lenses, his hair styled in the conservative cut that had made him invisible for 2 years. The transformation back to Theobald Grimsby felt like shedding a skin he'd grown too comfortable wearing. Without the expensive clothes and carefully cultivated confidence of Maximilian Ashford Blackwood, he was once again a man who blended into crowds and was quickly forgotten. The irony wasn't lost on him that after months of elaborate deception, his truest disguise was simply being himself. At 3:10, Ermintrude appeared in the doorway, her eyes scanning the coffee shop with the desperate intensity of someone hoping against hope to find what they were looking for. She wore a black dress that Maximilian had bought for her, and her hair was styled with the sort of casual elegance that suggested she'd put considerable effort into appearing effortlessly beautiful. She was looking for a dead man who had asked to meet her, and the confusion was written clearly across her features. Her gaze passed over Theobald twice before recognition finally dawned. He watched her face cycle through emotions, surprise, confusion, something that might have been relief, and finally a wariness that suggested she was beginning to understand that this meeting was more significant than she'd anticipated. She approached his table slowly, as though he might disappear if she moved too quickly. "Theo," she said tentatively, using the shortened version of his name that she'd once used with casual familiarity. "Hello, Ermintrude," he replied, standing with the same old-world courtesy that Maximilian had displayed, though it felt different when filtered through his original identity. "Thank you for coming. Please, sit down." She settled into the booth across from him with visible reluctance, her posture suggesting she was prepared to flee at any moment. "I don't understand," she said. "The message said Theobald Grimsby wanted to see me, but Theobald Grimsby is. I mean, you disappeared after." She stopped, apparently unable to finish the sentence that would reference their last encounter in the same location. "After you rejected my proposal and told me to find someone more suitable," Theobald supplied with a gentle smile. "Yes, I remember that conversation quite clearly." Ermintrude flushed, her cheeks coloring with what might have been shame or embarrassment. "Theo, about that day. I was harsh, unnecessarily cruel. I've thought about it many times since, and I want you to know that I regret how I handled the situation." "Do you regret what you said, or how you said it?" The question hung between them like a challenge. Ermintrude considered her words carefully before responding. "Both, I think. I was in a different place then. Different priorities, different understanding of what mattered. I was focused on things that seem less important now." "What changed your mind?" "I fell in love," she said simply, and Theobald felt something twist in his chest at the sincerity in her voice. "Real love, for the first time in my life. It taught me that connection between people is more valuable than any material consideration. That finding someone who truly understands you is rarer than anything money can buy." "Tell me about him," Theobald said, though the words felt like glass in his throat. Ermintrude's face lit up in a way that was both beautiful and heartbreaking. "His name is Maximilian. Maximilian Ashford Blackwood. He's extraordinary. Intelligent, cultured, generous. But more than that, he sees me. Really sees me, not just what I might represent or provide. When I'm with him, I feel like the best version of myself. He sounds remarkable. He is. Though he's disappeared recently, and I'm worried that something might have happened to him. He left a note saying business had called him away, But it's been 3 days and he hasn't returned my calls. I keep thinking. She stopped, shaking her head. I'm sorry, you didn't ask me here to listen to my problems. Why did you want to see me, Theo? And where have you been all these months? Theobald reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew the small velvet box that contained the modest engagement ring she had found so laughable 8 months earlier. He set it on the table between them, exactly as he had during their first encounter in this booth. I wanted to ask you a question, he said quietly. Ermintrude stared at the box, her face cycling through expressions of confusion, recognition, and something that might have been horror. Theo, what is this? The same proposal I made 8 months ago. The same ring you found so amusing. The same man you deemed unsuitable for consideration. He opened the box with steady fingers, revealing the small diamond that caught the coffee shop's fluorescent lighting and threw back tiny rainbows. I'm asking you again, Ermintrude. Will you marry me? Theo, I don't understand. What game is this? You disappeared for months, and now you return wanting to renew a proposal that we both know I can't accept? I told you, I'm in love with someone else. I'm committed to someone else. Are you? Theobald asked quietly. Or are you committed to what he represents? His wealth, his social connections, his ability to provide you with the lifestyle you believe you deserve. Ermintrude's eyes flashed with something that might have been anger. How dare you suggest that my feelings aren't genuine? I love Maximilian completely, for who he is, not what he has. Then let me ask you this. If you discovered tomorrow that Maximilian Ashford Blackwood was a fiction, that the man you love had been lying to you about his identity from the moment you met, would you still love him? The color drained from Ermintrude's face. What are you saying? I'm saying that sometimes the most important truths are hidden in plain sight. I'm saying that love built on deception is still love, even if the circumstances are complicated. I'm saying that the man who holds you while you sleep, who brings you coffee in the morning, who listens to you talk about your students, that man loves you completely, regardless of what name he uses or what identity he wears. Theo, you're frightening me. What are you trying to tell me? Theobald reached across the table and took her hand, noting how it trembled in his grasp. 8 months ago, you rejected Theobald Grimsby because he wasn't wealthy enough, sophisticated enough, or socially connected enough to meet your standards. You laughed at his modest ring and dismissed him as beneath your consideration. Do you remember what you said to me that day? Ermintrude's voice trembled, her eyes locked on the ring, its modest diamond glinting under the coffee shop's harsh lights. Theobald held her gaze, his heart pounding with a mixture of dread and hope. This was the moment he'd been building toward for months, the culmination of his elaborate deception, and yet it felt like the most honest thing he'd done since he first saw her in this very place. I remember every word, Theobald said, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. You told me I was a sweet man, but not enough. You said I fell spectacularly short of your standards. You laughed, Ermintrude. You laughed at me, at this ring, at the life I was offering. And I've spent every day since proving you wrong, not just to you, but to myself. Her hand slipped from his, and she leaned back in the booth, her expression a mix of shock and dawning realization. Theo, what are you saying? Are you telling me you've been, playing some kind of game with me? Because of that day? Not a game, he said softly. A test. For both of us. I wanted to know if you could love someone for who they are, not what they have. I wanted to know if I could be someone worthy of love, even after everything I've been through. So I became Maximilian Ashford Blackwood. The silence that followed was deafening. Ermintrude's face went pale, her lips parting as if to speak, but no words came. Her eyes darted between Theobald and the ring, as though trying to reconcile the man before her with the one she'd fallen in love with over the past months. The coffee shop's ambient noise, clinking cups, murmured conversations faded into a distant hum, leaving only the weight of their shared truth. You're Maximilian, she whispered finally, her voice barely audible. That's not possible. I've lived with him, you for months. I know him. His life, his world, his everything. You can't be him. I am, Theobald said, pulling a small card from his pocket, a business card with Maximilian Ashford Blackwood's name and phone number, the same one he'd given her at the New Year's Eve gala. He placed it on the table beside the ring. I created him for you. The wealth, the connections, the charm, it was all designed to fit the mold of what you thought you wanted. And you fell for it, Ermintrude. You fell in love with a lie. Tears welled in her eyes, and she shook her head, as if denying the truth could make it disappear. No, that's not true. I love Maximilian for who he is, not for his money or his status. I love the way he listens to me, the way he makes me feel seen. That wasn't a lie. That was real. Was it? Theobald asked, his tone gentle but unrelenting. If I'd come to you as Theobald Grimsby, with my insurance clerk's salary and my ordinary life, would you have given me a second glance after that day? Would you have shared your dreams with me, moved into my apartment, planned a future together? Or would you have laughed again? Ermintrude flinched, as though his words were physical blows. I was wrong that day, she said, her voice breaking. I was cruel, and I've regretted it ever since. But you manipulated me. You lied to me, Theo. You made me believe in someone who didn't exist. How is that better than what I did to you? It's not, he admitted, his own voice cracking with the weight of his confession. I thought it would be. I thought making you fall in love with Maximilian would prove that you were shallow, that your rejection was proof of some fundamental flaw in you. But the deeper I went, the more I saw of you, the real you, the woman who loves her students, who dreams of making a difference, who makes me laugh in ways I'd forgotten were possible. And I realized I wasn't just fooling you. I was fooling myself. He leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly on the table. I love you, Ermintrude. Not as Maximilian, but as me. Theobald Grimsby. The man you rejected. The man who's been hiding from his past for years, who thought he could outrun it by becoming someone else. I love you, and I need to know if you can love me. Not the penthouse, not the gala invitations, but me. She stared at him, tears streaming down her cheeks now, her hands trembling as she reached for the ring box. She didn't open it, just held it, as though it might burn her if she looked too closely. You don't understand what you're asking, she said finally. You're asking me to forgive you for lying to me, for manipulating me, for making me believe in a life that wasn't real. And you're asking me to love someone I hurt so badly that he felt the need to do this to me. I'm asking you to see me, Theobald said. The way I've seen you. I know who you are, Ermintrude. I know your ambitions, your insecurities, your kindness, your cruelty. I've seen it all, and I love you anyway. Can you do the same for me? For a long moment, she said nothing, her gaze fixed on the ring box. Theobald watched her, every second stretching into eternity, knowing that her answer would define not just their future, but who he would become when he left this coffee shop. He'd spent months orchestrating this moment, but now that it was here, he felt utterly powerless, stripped bare by the truth he'd laid at her feet. Finally, Ermintrude opened the box, staring at the ring she'd once mocked. Her fingers traced its edges, and a small, broken laugh escaped her lips, not the cruel laughter of 8 months ago, but something softer, sadder, laced with regret. I was so wrong about this ring, she said. It's beautiful in its way. Simple. Honest. I didn't see that then. She looked up at him, her eyes searching his face as though seeing him for the first time. I don't know if I can be the person you want me to be, Theo. I don't know if I can love you the way you deserve, not after everything we've done to each other. But I want to try. I want to know who you really are, not just the man you pretended to be. Can we start over? Theobald felt something loosen in his chest, a knot of pain and anger that had been there so long he'd forgotten what it was like to breathe without it. He reached across the table, taking her hand again, and this time she didn't pull away. I'd like that, he said, his voice thick with emotion. No lies this time. Just us. They sat there for a long time, hands clasped across the scarred wooden table, the ring box between them like a fragile promise. The coffee shop's familiar hum resumed around them, but for Theobald and Ermintrude, the world had shifted. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. Too much had been broken, too many truths exposed for that, but it was a beginning, raw and uncertain and real. 6 months later, Theobald Grimsby stood outside a small bookstore on Meridian Street, not far from the coffee shop where everything had begun and ended. The sign above the door read, Grimsby and Ashworth Books, a modest venture funded by the sale of the penthouse and a portion of Theobald's carefully hidden assets. Inside, Ermintrude was arranging a display of classic novels, her auburn hair tucked behind her left ear as she debated the placement of Pride and Prejudice. They hadn't married, not yet. The ring remained in its box, a symbol of a question neither was ready to ask or answer again. But they were building something together, something grounded in the truth of who they were, flaws and all. Theobald had told her everything, his past and intelligence, his years in hiding, the reasons behind his deception. She had listened, sometimes crying, sometimes angry, but always staying, choosing to face the mess of their shared history rather than run from it. Theobald's old contacts, including Cordelia, had faded back into the shadows, respecting his decision to leave that world behind. Ermintrude had resigned from St. Agatha's, finding a new purpose in the bookstore, where she hosted readings and book clubs for students who reminded her of the girls she'd once taught. They lived in a small apartment above the shop, not unlike the one Theobald had once occupied alone, but it felt different now, warmer, fuller, alive with the small rituals of their shared life. As he watched Ermintrude through the window, Theobald felt a quiet contentment settle over him. Revenge had been a fire that consumed everything it touched, but love, real, flawed, hard-won love, was a slow-growing thing, like a seed planted in uncertain soil. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. He pushed open the door, the bell chiming softly, and Ermintrude looked up with a smile that reached her eyes. "You're late," she teased, echoing their first meetings. "Only by a minute," he replied, crossing the room to kiss her gently. "I was enjoying the view." She laughed, and it was the sound he'd fallen in love with, not in a penthouse or a ballroom, but right here, in a bookstore that carried both their names. For the first time in years, Theobald Grimsby felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be,